A successful interior designer gets ready to celebrate Thanksgiving with her family, but she never shows up.
The perpetrator of this crime wore the clues very close to his heart.
Investigators search for an assailant whose motive did not seem to match the crime.
So much violence was inflicted for such a small amount of money, it didn't add up.
It's the day after Thanksgiving in Melbourne, Florida, and police get a frantic call.
911, Melbourne emergency. Are you sure she's not breathing? Do you know the subject's name? And where is she located?
When I arrived on the scene, I made contact with the caller, who advised us that she'd found the body of her friend, Barbara Ann Barber, in the parking lot at the rear of her business. The first thing I observed was her purse lying on the steps, and the contents were spilled out onto the stairway. Next, I moved over and I saw the body of Barbara Ann Barber. She was lying on the ground. She had an electrical cord wrapped around her neck, and it appeared that she had numerous contusions on her face as if she'd been struck several times.
The case is turned over to homicide detective Bob Sarver.
Officer King told me that when they got there, Mrs. Barber was found pretty much all the way up underneath the stairway. There were some indications that she'd been sexually assaulted. She was partially unclothed. Some of her underwear looked like it had been stuffed in her mouth. She had some contusions to her face, looked like she'd been beaten. And it was obvious to them that she'd been murdered.
This was a very violent crime.
They did find her wallet and some other items, but they couldn't find any cash. Her car was there, the door was open on the passenger side, and she looked like she was either unloading or loading some boxes.
Detective Sarver goes to speak with his only witness, the family friend who discovered Mrs. Barber's body.
The witnesses described Barbara Ann Barber as somebody who was very well respected in the interior design industry.
Initial signs point to a robbery.
The witness who found her said that she commonly wore some jewelry, a real nice watch, and some necklaces. Both of those were missing from her body.
The crime scene unit arrives, hoping to find evidence.
We documented the scene with photographs. We observed obvious signs of a struggle taking place. There were also blood stains on the railing and step area, and also on the ground below.
He also finds an electrical cord, the one used to strangle Mrs. Barber. The victim's clothing and some items from her purse are sent to the lab to check for fingerprints and DNA. First, a hunt for prints.
I processed different items for fingerprints using black powder and also super glue fuming with negative results.
Investigators send the blood collected at the crime scene to the lab for analysis.
Most of the blood samples sent off for DNA analysis matched Mrs. Barber.
But not all. Tiny amounts of blood from the crime scene are determined to belong to a man. Police now have a trace of their killer. But detectives need a suspect to make a DNA match. Detective Sarver goes to the victim's house to see if he can find any other clues to her murder.
We didn't find anything unusual. Found some insurance paperwork about the jewelry.
But not the jewels themselves. Those are still missing. And there is something that continues to trouble detectives.
You know, there was an extreme amount of violence involved. It just didn't make sense to us that if all you're really after is to steal someone's jewelry, why you would sexually assault them, why you would murder them, why you would choke them, why would you stuff a portion of their clothing in their mouth.
To answer these questions, Detective Sarver calls criminal profiler Dale Hinman.
When I spoke with Detective Sarver about this case, I was struck by how violent this crime was compared to how little money was actually taken. In every homicide investigation, we look at how the crime was committed and the way the victim was left in order to begin to create a profile of the unknown offender.
And Dale already has some ideas about the perpetrator.
Based on the crime scene photos and the details of this crime, I thought that the man who killed Barbara Ann Barber lived in the neighborhood and knew he would have time to commit this crime without getting caught. I've investigated a lot of murders, but this case was very different. The offender did so much more than what was necessary to rob this victim. I wanted to go to the crime scene to see if there was something there that would give us some clues.
This is the back of the business right here. Her stuff was here, and then it was strewn like all the way down, even down into the bottom here. And it looked like somebody just kind of sat down and sorted through her purse.
Would any of these businesses be open during that time?
No, not at that time. But most of this area down here was been closed up pretty good.
Well, remaining in the area after the person's been sexually assaulted and murdered, it seems like possibly the offender would maybe live in this area and would know that he could come back into this spot and have a secluded place to commit a crime.
This alleyway, and from both sides, hardly anybody would have been down through here.
It sounds like the offender may have done some surveillance in this area to see which of these businesses had a lone female employee who would be more vulnerable to an attack.
A couple of the witnesses we talked to said she always wore some gold chains and she had a really nice watch. When she was found, all those things were missing.
Was money also taken?
We didn't find any in her purse.
I think that since the initial crime was the robbery, I think that he stole the jewelry and intended to sell it to get more money. Maybe he's a drug abuser and completely lost control. It sounds like he took a robbery situation and escalated it way beyond what was necessary just to get the property and the money from her.
It seems like he easily overpowered her, beat her fairly severely in the face. Why kill her?
Well, the crime really suggests to me that the person really had issues with women, very negative issues.
When an offender overcommits a crime like this, it gives us clues into his personality. He probably had a history of bad experiences or poor relationships with women.
Detective Sarver calls a meeting. One of the investigators working the case has new information.
In case you haven't met her, this is Dale Hinman.
The witness who discovered the victim's body told the investigators that she had been to Mrs. Barber's design shop the day before the murder.
And the witness had her daughter with her, who saw something that so frightened her, she locked her car door. It was a man lurking outside of the shop, staring into the windows. And the daughter gives an interesting description.
She said he was a very dark-skinned male, but he was not black and not Latino. We thought that was a very unusual description. We were wondering what she meant by this. Did she say what he was wearing?
Actually, she had said that he was kind of unkempt. He had jeans, sneakers, and a blue plaid shirt.
But what about the missing jewelry?
Angela, when you talked to her friend, did she say anything about whether or not she noticed Mrs. Barber having that watch on or not?
She did have the watch on in addition to a couple of gold necklaces that she wore as well.
Good.
Finally, a lead. They have a description of a suspect stalking the victim, and the missing designer watch has a serial number that can be traced.
We thought that finding the victim's jewelry would bring us one step closer to finding her killer.
Then, another lead and a potential break in the case.
We got a phone call from a woman who had seen the news about Miss Barber's death. She said she had some information that might help us with her case.
She said that a friend of hers had given her a watch that was identical to the one that she'd seen on the news. She only knew him by the first name of Tank. She gave us a pretty good description. So he was a heavy-set black male, and she frequently saw him in and around the area where Mrs. Barber's shop was at.
She gave us a watch that matched the description of the one that Mrs. Barber was wearing.
Will the serial numbers match the ones on Barbara Ann Barber's missing watch?
We actually had the insurance paperwork, and we were able to positively verify that it was Mrs. Barber's watch.
Investigators can now link the watch to Tank. But who is Tank, and how did he get Mrs. Barber's missing jewelry? They checked the Florida Department of Corrections database, searching for nicknames and aliases, and get a hit.
Tank Hutchinson's actual name was Denva Hutchinson.
And Denva Hutchinson has a history of drug arrests.
We thought that whoever killed Barbara Ann Barber was going to sell the jewelry to obtain drugs, and Hutchinson's drug history fell right in line with that.
But what about the vicious nature of the crime?
We were also interested in learning whether or not he had a history of violence against women.
Did Tank Hutchinson kill Barbara Ann Barber? Police are about to find out. Barbara Ann Barber's missing watch has turned up and leads the police to a suspect named Tank Hutchinson. But does he fit Agent Hinman's profile?
It turned out that Tank Hutchinson did not have the history of violence that we expected he would have in this case. So maybe whoever he got the watch from was actually the one who stole it.
Police want to question Hutchinson, and they don't have to look far to find him. He is already behind bars.
When detectives started interviewing Denva Hutchinson, he denied knowing anything about the jewelry or the murder.
Detective Sarver and Agent Hinman don't believe him. They get his permission to take a DNA sample. But to Sarver's surprise, the tests clear Hutchinson. However, Hutchinson's DNA doesn't tell the whole story.
He told us that he was at an area motel watching a football game with another friend of his. While they were there, he was approached by a guy that he only knew as Jim. Jim had a watch and 2 necklaces. Jim said, "Why don't you see if you can pawn this stuff and get some money so we can buy some crack cocaine with it?" And that's actually what Hutchinson did. He sold the 2 chains, but he was attracted to this girl, and he gave the watch to this young girl.
Detectives wanted to know who Jim is, but Hutchinson said he didn't know his last name. He described him as a dark-skinned male, but he said he wasn't black and he wasn't Latino. That's the second time we heard this description.
Hutchinson said that he knew that Jim had been just recently released from prison, and sometimes he would stay at a homeless shelter that's maybe within a mile.
The fact that Jim sometimes stayed in a homeless shelter meant that he probably had a limited amount of clothing, so limited that he may still have or even be wearing the clothes that he wore on the night of the murder. The detectives checked the shelter, and there was no record of a man named Jim that was currently staying there.
Next stop, the motel where Hutchinson said he met Jim.
We were given access to the registration slips. Not only did we find out that a person who was named James Savage had stayed there during the time that the murder occurred, and the clerk also told us that he was still staying there.
Sarver calls for backup. Police have stormed the hotel room of James Savage, top suspect in the murder of Barbara Ann Barber. And one glance tells them they have found their man.
James Savage was a very large, dark-skinned male. When the police checked his record, they learned that he was an Australian Aborigine. That helped to explain the witness's description of him. But just as significant, he had a long history for violence and drug abuse.
With each new piece of information, James Savage is fitting perfectly into Dale's profile.
He lived within a mile of Miss Barber's shop, and there was one more thing the police noticed right away.
There appeared to be blood on both his shirt and his shoes.
Two blood samples sent off matched. I then did a presumptive blood test and got a positive reaction for blood.
But whose blood is it?
If that blood matched Barbara Ann Barber's, then the police could have their man.
To find out, they send the samples to the state crime lab. While they wait, Detective Sarver questions James Savage.
Savage denied killing Miss Barber. He blamed Mr. Hutchinson. Savage said that the original idea with Hutchinson and him was to steal her car. In the process of getting into her car, Savage said that Miss Barber came outside, discovered what they were doing. He said that he punched her in the face, and after he punched her in the face, he said that he took the money out of her purse, but that he didn't kill her, and it was Hutchinson that had killed her.
But James Savage's DNA was about to prove him wrong. Barbara Ann Barber's blood was identified on James Savage's shirt and his shoes. Detectives confronted Savage with the test results, and at that point, he confessed to murdering Mrs. Barber. As we learned more about James Savage, we began to understand where his hostility against women was coming from. James Savage had a story.
In Australia at the time, it was a practice of the government at that time to remove children from the Aboriginal parents. He was adopted by some missionaries who were in Australia at the time, and later on in his early life was even abandoned by his adopted mother.
Dale Hinman's profile is fitting perfectly.
We all thought that whoever killed Barbara Ann Barber had some real issues with women. He took what could have been a simple robbery with a compliant victim and turned it into a beating, a sexual assault, and ultimately a murder.
Legally excuses.
And his defense? That he himself was a victim for being taken away from his mother.
Many people are abused or abandoned by their parents, and they grow up to be law-abiding citizens. Fortunately, the detectives and the members of the jury saw through this excuse and gave him the punishment he deserved.
Mandatory minimum sentence of life.
James Savage was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison.